Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's session. Tonight we're going to talk about the 47 PMBOK project management processes. Before we start, I would like to find out if somebody could just on chat respond. Can you hear me clearly? Thanks a lot. See you can hear me. Okay, let's have a look and see what these 47 processes are all about. Now, if we look at these different processes, the 47 of them, they are grouped together in 5 different process groups: the initiating, the planning, the executing, monitoring, controlling, and the closing. And if you look at the way that the PMBOK guide explains it, it does give us sometimes the indication that these processes are running one after another. Although the PMBOK guide also very clearly says that we must take into consideration that these processes can be repeated and they can overlap. So as you can see from this slide over here, you will find that while you are still busy with some of the initiating processes, you might already start doing some of the planning. While you are still busy with some of the planning, you might start with the executing. And obviously monitoring and controlling will be all along, because you need to monitor and control when you're executing, but also you're planning and you're initiating and you're closing. And then at the end, you're going to close down. So if we have a look at what does these processes and the process groups consist of. First of all, if you look at this slide here, we've got the knowledge areas, the 10 knowledge areas on top. On the left-hand side, we've got the 5 process groups, and then next to it, there are 4 phases. Now, those phases over there do not relate 100% to groups, because you might find initiating and planning and executing and monitoring, controlling and closing activities in all of your phases. But if we look at our initiating phase, then we'll find that that is where we'll find the majority of our initiating processes. Our planning phase, the majority of our planning processes. Execution phase, we would find our executing activities or processes, as well as our monitoring and controlling. That's where the most of them will be, and obviously the same for our closeout. So to look at what we mean when we talk about our initiating. In our initiating processes, it's all to do with defining the initial scope of the project, to commit our initial financial resources, to identify the internal and the external stakeholders, and obviously to appoint the project manager. Once we start looking just now at the interfaces between our knowledge areas and our process groups, we will see how these aspects come to life. If we continue to our planning ones, what do we do in the planning processes? Obviously, we must establish the total scope of our project and our product. We must define and we must refine all our objectives. And at the high level, we've already done that at the initiating stage. In the planning one, we're going to do the detail of that. And then also to develop a course of action, how we're going to meet these objectives. Our executing processes, all those have to do with coordinating our resources, managing our stakeholders' expectations, and then also to integrate and perform the activities of our project in accordance with our project management plan. So all in all, what it means is, while we are in planning, we're going to do our project management plan together, and that'll be our baseline. And in execution, we execute that project management plan. Looking at our monitoring, controlling, that's monitoring, controlling, and executing run concurrently. So here we're going to track and review the progress and the performance of the project. We're going to control changes, and we can recommend corrective and corrective actions in there. And we're also going to monitor our ongoing project activities. And what do we do when we monitor our activities? We're going to look at what our planning was, and we're then going to look at what actually happened, our execution and planning, the baselines in our project management plan, and execution, the actuals, what's actually happening. So in monitoring and controlling, we are comparing those two to see if there's any variance, and if so, what we're going to do. I just want to answer, I see there's a question, whether we will get the presentation. Yes, the presentation will be available after the session. I think by early next week it will be there. Good. If we continue to at the closing ones, what does closing got to do with? In our closing activities, we need to conduct a post-project or phase-end review. So that gives us an indication that we are going to have closing or miniature closures for phases also, and then the proper project closeout at the end. During closing, the closing activities or processes also to do with finalizing our lessons learned. Now, when do we document lessons learned? As and when they occur on project, but when we are in closing, we need to finalize and put them in perspective. Also, during the closing process groups, we're going to archive our project documents, we're going to close out our procurement, that's very important, and then we must also make certain that we release all our project resources. If we look at the knowledge areas, we've now looked at what the process groups are. If we look at the knowledge areas, we've got 10 there. And what are those 10 knowledge areas? First of all, integration, our integration knowledge area. Now that's not a true knowledge area. That is the area where we're going to do trade-offs and we're going to integrate all the other knowledge areas to come up with the best possible plan for our project. Then our next one, I just want to see if there's another question. Ask if it's on the site. You will be informed of where it is. Don't worry about that. The next one is the scope. So what do we do in our scope knowledge area? That is where we must make certain that our project includes all the work and only the work required that we need to do to complete our project successfully. So that's all to do with what is included in the project and what is not included in the project. We also need to look at our time. Now, what is the time knowledge area? All to do with how we're going to plan and manage our time on the project up until completion. We also have to look at a knowledge area of the cost, managing our cost, so that the project can be completed within the approved budget. Important. And if we look at scope, cost, and time, the three major baselines that we have on a project, we also need to have a look at our quality. So our knowledge area on quality, that's where we ensure that our project and our product requirements are met so that the project will satisfy the needs for which it was undertaken. And that's the basis of what quality is all about, making certain that it meets the needs for why we have done this project. Our human resources zooms in on our organizing, our managing, our leading of our project team. So that means we have to determine where we're going to get the people, how we're going to get them, how we're going to develop them, how we're going to release them at the end of the day. Our communications, and the communication knowledge area is all to do with how do we manage the flow of information on our project. And that information flows from the project team to the stakeholders in the form of reporting, but it also flows from our stakeholders to the project team, mainly in the form of the requirements on the project. Our risk, one of our knowledge areas is also looking at risk on the project, and that is how do we manage the uncertainty on the project. Risk being, the definition of risk being that it is an uncertain future event, that if it would happen, it could have a negative or a positive impact on one or more of my project objectives. So we need to determine what the risk is and what we're going to do about it. Procurement, for all of those activities or processes that we are not going to be able, or we do not want to answer from out of our project, we will have to make a decision. Are we going to buy it from outside if we don't make it ourselves? So we'll have a make or buy decision, and that's where procurement falls in. That is to regulate all the contractual obligations for the part of the project that we're going to fund from outside, whether it is material or whether it is skills or whether it is equipment, but those that we procure from outside. We also have to manage our stakeholder satisfaction. And that was what the last knowledge area is all about. And while going through these knowledge areas, you'll see that there is always a very close interaction and relationship amongst all of them. So if we start off these 47 processes, what are we talking about here? First of all, the blue dots that you see there, over there. If you look at those blue ones, there's numbers in there, and those numbers tells us how many processes are there in that intersection. So you'll see under initiation, we've got one process under integration and initiation, and one process under stakeholders and initiation. Under planning, in total, you'll see that there are 24 processes that play a role there, under executing 8, and under monitoring controlling 11, and then under closing again 2. And if we add up all of those, either from the knowledge areas totals or from the process group totals, in the corner, the right at the bottom, you'll see that gives us the 47 processes that we are talking about. Now, if we first of all, this little sentence up there, it might be a bit confusing. I see the cat quickly hissing commands, real panic stricken. That's one way for me where I can remember what these processes or the knowledge areas are in order. I see the cat quickly hissing commands, real panic stricken. So if I can recreate my knowledge areas in this exact order over here, and I know how my processes go down, and I can in my mind have a clear picture and recreate where these interfaces are and which processes are there, it gives me a very clear idea of all the 47 processes that we're talking about in the PMBOK guide. And if I understand how those 47 processes follow each other, how they interact with each other, then I have got a very good idea of the whole of the PMBOK guide. This is actually a summary of the whole of our PMBOK guide. Those of you that have edition 5 of the PMBOK guide, the information on these set of slides that we're going to talk about tonight, you would find a summary of that on page 61 of the guide also. Not in the same format as this, but you will find the same information there. So let's have a look at the different processes. The first one is, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through a very generic project in PMBOK world. So we'll discuss it from the beginning to the end, how these different processes flow one after another. And the very first process that I have to do in a project is developing my project charter. Now, what is this project charter all about? The project charter is a document that appoints the project manager. It acknowledges that there is a project, and it's also high-level information. High-level information on the project charter, I would have to know what a high-level scope is, what the high-level time requirements or time available is. I should have some high-level idea of how much the project is going to cost me. A high-level idea if any specific quality requirements are there. High-level human resources, if there's specific skills I need. Any high-level communication requirements. Maybe this is a secret project, or there is some intellectual property all there. High-level risks. Now, on my risks here, when I'm looking at my project charter, it does not mean that I'm going to unpack those risks and come up with response strategies. No, it just means I need to have a clear picture of how much risk there are on this project, because that will help us to decide whether we're going to continue with this project or not. As far as procurement is, I will also have in my project charter if there are any high-level aspects about procurement. For instance, do we have a pre-selected suppliers list that we must use, or whatever the case may be. So once I have now completed my project charter and my project charter has been approved, I can go and I can determine who are all the stakeholders. But while I'm still busy with my project charter, I will also have my key stakeholders in my project charter also. So high level, my stakeholders will be there. But once I have now got the approval to continue, I will now go and I will now identify all the stakeholders on the project. And identifying those stakeholders, I'm going to document that in a stakeholder register. So that stakeholder register in its basic form would be a list of all the stakeholders and what are the requirements. I'm going to look at quality requirements, the communication requirements, the requirements for my project, where in the project they're interested. Are they interested in the whole project or in certain phases? And what are the expectations of my project? So once I have done that, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start my planning. So in doing my planning, I'm going to develop my project management plan. But I cannot develop this project management plan if I have not done the detailed planning for all my other knowledge areas. So I must have detailed planning for scope, time, cost, quality, human resources, communication, etc. And the end result of all that planning would at the end of the day be documented in my project management plan. And in doing so, when I look at my scope, I will also take into consideration how much money do I have, how much time do I have, what are the quality requirements. When I look at my time, I will look at what is the scope. So they can influence one another all along. And as I continue there, I will have to make trade-offs until I get a plan at the end of the day that is a realistic plan, it's a feasible plan, and it is accepted by my stakeholders. And that plan is the one that I'm going to use to do my execution. So looking at our first knowledge area that I'm going to do detailed planning about is my scope management plan. What is scope management to do? First of all, I need to determine what is included in my project and what's excluded. I must determine the boundaries of my project. And those 4 processes we're talking about there, first of all, is I must have a scope management plan. And you will see that going through planning, the very first activity or process on each and every one of those interfaces there for planning would be a management plan. So one of the principles that we have in the PMBOK guide is that we do not do anything unless we get approval up front on how we're going to do it. So I'm not going to go and determine what is the scope of my project, or find out or talk to my stakeholders and find out what is included and what's not included, unless we haven't first agreed on how we're going to do it, who's going to be involved, and all that type of stuff. So once I've got my scope management plan and we've agreed on how we're going to do it, the next thing is that we must start to collect the requirements. Now, where do I collect the requirements from? That is why I've already determined who my stakeholders are. The stakeholders are the people that's going to give me my requirements. The next thing that I need to do is I now need to define what is the scope, what is included, what's not included in the project, and I do that from the requirements that I've identified. The 4th process there would be to create a work breakdown structure. I take my scope and I now break it down into workable portions, down to the level what we call a work breakdown structure. So I'm going to decompose the total scope of this project into the level where I can quite easily do my planning, where I can do my estimating and my budgeting on those different levels. I can also allocate it to one person or to a small group of people, and it would also be possible for me to easily monitor and control the work as it's been executed. If we have now determined what is our scope, what is included and what is excluded, the next thing that we need to do is we need to determine how long is it going to take us. Now, one of the principles of this model that the PMBOK guide uses, that's a waterfall model. So it works from the assumption that first of all, we will and we can determine the total scope of the project. From there, we can determine how long it's going to take us. Then with that information, we can determine how much it's going to cost us, and then we can do all the rest of them. Although we will first look at the scope, then the time, and then the cost, there are trade-offs in between. So we're going to do a little bit of scope, and then we're going to come back to time, and then we'll see what the cost implication is, and then we might maybe need to adjust our scope again, and so forth and so on, until we've done our trade-offs, and we've come to the point where we say that with this amount of money, within this time frame, I can do this amount of work, taking all the other knowledge areas requirements into consideration. So looking at time, what do I need to do if I am looking at my knowledge area of time and I'm busy with my planning? First of all, I need to determine what my roadmap or my schedule management plan is going to be. Oh, who's going to be involved in the scheduling? How are we going to do the scheduling? Are we going to use critical path? Are we going to use critical chain? Are we going to work in work days, work weeks, work months, or maybe, you never know, it might be in minutes and hours. What I also need to do in my time is I need to define the activities. Now, when we were busy looking at the scope, we've already done our WBS and we broke it down into work package level. Those work packages we would have taken and we've decomposed those in our WBS dictionary down to activity level. So we would have determined some of the activities already there, but under the time we make certain that we have got all the activities and any additional activities that became known through the scheduling part. Once we have determined all the activities, what we also need to do is we need to sequence these activities. That means we need to determine what is the relationship or the dependencies amongst these activities, which one can start first, which ones can come second and third, which of these activities can run concurrently, and so forth. So we sequence all the activities. The next thing that we need to do is we need to estimate how many resources are we going to allocate to each and every activity. And those resources are human resources, material, equipment, etc. The fifth thing there is to determine how long these activities are going to take, each and every individual one from. And how long will it take? It will be impacted by the scope of the activity. It will be impacted by the number and the quality of the different resources that I've allocated to that activity. And it will also be impacted by where in the sequence of this project it's going to happen. So now that I've estimated the activity durations and I know what the relationships between the activities are, the dependencies, I can now develop my project schedule. And that schedule that I'm developing there, initially it is normally a network diagram where I would develop my network diagram, and then when I allocate the resources to them, and I'd also take into consideration the working hours and the non-working hours that I've got on my project, then I will develop a bar chart type of schedule that we are talking about. Now, just to come back to our scope, when we looked at our scope just now, our baseline on our scope would be our WBS and our WBS dictionary. If we look at our time, what would our baseline be in our time? It would be in our schedule. So it will either be in a project schedule or in the network diagram. Now that we know what it is that we're going to do, how long it's going to take us, we can also determine how much it's going to cost us. So in determining the cost, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do our cost management plan. Again, I need to agree with my stakeholders what it is we're going to do, who's going to do what, and as far as cost is concerned, if we have got an international project, are we going to use euros, dollars, or whatever denomination we're going to use there. The next thing I need to do is I need to estimate my costs. Now, estimating the cost, what we're talking about is I'm going to take all the activities that I've defined under scope and under time, and I'm going to cost each and every individual one of them. When I look at determining the budget, it means that I'm now going to get a time-phased budget. So I'm going to aggregate all those costs together, taking my network diagram into consideration to see where it's going to happen, and I would at the end of the day come up with a cost baseline that's going to tell me on my project how do I plan to spend the money over the duration of the project. That is why in PMBOK world we do our network diagram before we do our costing. But obviously, as I said previously, there will always be trade-offs between the cost, the time, and the scope. Now, continuing further, I also need to determine what we're going to do with our quality. Now, first of all, the first activity there is our quality management plan. In other words, how am I going to implement quality on my project? And a lot of times it can be as simple as to just say that I'm going to implement the quality management system of my parent company on my project, or I'm going to use ISO 9000 or whatever the case may be. There is a second part to that quality, And the one is the roadmap on how we're going to do it, and the other one is which standards are we going to adhere to. Will it be a project-only standard? Is it going to be an industry standard? Is it going to be a company standard or standards? Or is it going to be ISO standards? So we need to agree on what standard it is that we are going to work towards. Going on, I also need to do planning on my human resources. So I need a HR, a human resources management plan. How am I going to get the people? How am I going to develop them? How am I going to manage them? How am I going to release them at the end of the day? Communications, I need a communications management plan. In other words, how am I going to plan and how I'm going to make certain that I can manage the flow of information on my project. And in there, what I would have my communication management plan is who is allowed to get what information, which reporting will I have, the reports that I'm going to give. I would also have in there to say how frequent they are, what level of detail, all that type of stuff. As far as my risks are concerned, I also need a risk management plan. So who's going to be involved, all the definitions and all the process that I'm going to follow, the activities for identifying my risks, analyzing my risks, and then also to come up with a risk response. And then once I have agreed on that plan, what we will then do is we will go and identify our risks, all of those uncertainties that can impact either positively or negatively on one or more of my project objectives. I'm also going to analyze those risks, and in PMBOK world we refer to a qualitative risk analysis and then a quantitative. Now, the qualitative risk analysis is a quick way to determine which of these risks are the most important so that I can mark those risks that warrant a proper quantitative risk analysis. And qualitative risk analysis means I'm going to say maybe high, medium or low, or red, green, yellow, whatever the case may be. Use something like that to identify the risks. Whereas if I'm looking at a quantitative risk analysis, I might say that there's a 10% probability that a certain risk can occur, and if it occurs, it might have a $10 million impact on my project. Then the last thing there is I need to come up with my risk response strategy. Once I have analyzed my risks, I'm going to then mark those risks that warrant a risk response strategy. I'm going to come up with a risk response strategy. And that risk response strategy can mean that there would be an impact on time. It might mean that I'm going to need more time to do it. I just want to get this. It doesn't want to come now. I might need more time to do it. I might need money to do it. It might mean a change to the scope or to have impact on the quality and so forth. So I cannot complete my project management plan unless I've done my risk management plan. After that, I also need to determine what my procurement management plan is all about. In other words, how am I going to procure? How am I going to make or buy decisions? What type of contracts am I going to use? Any contract clauses that needs to be in? Am I going to have a contracting person on my project, or are we going to use a contracting or a legal department? All those things need to be sorted out. As far as my stakeholders are concerned, I need a stakeholder management plan. And in that stakeholder management plan, I'm going to determine what the requirements for the stakeholders are. I'm also going to have in there my strategy. How am I going to move my stakeholders from where they are towards the project now to where I need them? In other words, their current position to their desired. I might have a stakeholder that might have a lot of influence and a lot of power on my project, and is very interested in the project. And he might be negative towards the project, and I need this person to be positive towards my project. So I need a strategy. How am I going to move this stakeholder from being negative to being positive, or maybe just moving him from being negative to being neutral, in which case at least I don't have to fight him or her every day. Now, if we now have done all our planning and we have made our trade-offs and we have got agreement with our stakeholders, then that means that we have got our project management plan approved. And if we've got our project management plan approved, we have got authorized, and that now becomes our baseline. So we've got a scope baseline, a time baseline, a cost baseline. We've got the management plan, so they're actually miniature baselines for all of the other areas. And when we are now going to execute it, all we need to do is we need to do what we've promised to do in our project management plan. We don't have to do anything more or anything less. So the very first process there in integration, when we look at executing, would be that we direct and we manage our project work. Now, in directing and managing the project work, what does that mean? That means that if we are looking at the areas where, like for scope, time, cost, it means that I would also manage the scope, manage the progress against time, manage the progress against cost. When I look at my quality, you'll see that I'm going to do quality assurance. Now, what is quality assurance? The quality assurance there says that those standards that I've agreed upon when I did my quality planning, quality assurance asks the question, will I be able to meet the standards? So it's all to do with the processes, the capability, and the people. I also, when I'm busy executing, I need to acquire my project team under human resources. I need to develop my team, and I need to manage the team. And obviously, at the end of the day, I'm also going to release my team when we get into the closing part. As far as communication is concerned, I need to manage those communications. Nothing else than doing what I promised to do, nothing more, nothing else. So all reports must flow on the times that we've agreed upon to the right people and so forth. As far as my procurement is concerned, I need to conduct my procurements. So I have now in my planning determined how am I going to do this. Over here in executing, I need to conduct it. So I'm going to go out on tender. I'm going to get the responses. I'm going to negotiate. I'm going to evaluate them and negotiate. And at the end of the day, we're going to enter into contracts for the delivery of services or material or whatever the case may be. As far as my stakeholder engagement is concerned, I also need to manage my stakeholder engagement. And that means that I'm now going to execute my strategy in my stakeholder management plan. So I'm going to do what I promised to do there. The same time that we are executing, we're also monitoring and controlling. So what does it mean if I monitor and control? That's, as I said just now, is I need to make certain what is the baseline that I've agreed upon in my project management plan and what actually is happening from executing. What is the difference between the two? Do I need to do anything about it? So the first thing is I'm going to monitor and control my project work. And then the second process under integration there is that I'm going to perform integrated change control. Now, why does integrated change control start to play a role now? Because the moment that my project management plan has been approved, then I have got my baselines. So any changes to my project management plan from this point forward needs to go through formal change control. That's why we've got integrated change control there. I'm also going to, under monitoring and controlling, have to monitor and control the scope. And what does that mean? It's got the two processes there of validating the scope and controlling the scope. Now, first of all, what does controlling the scope means? It means to compare what we've agreed, what's our scope baseline, and what we're actually doing, to see if there's any variance there. And if so, it would have to go through integrated change control if changes are needed. Validate the scope asks two very simple questions. First of all, have I done everything? And if so, has what I've done been accepted by my customers or my stakeholders? And if the answer to both of them is yes, I have done everything and yes, everything has been accepted, that means that I have delivered the product scope of my project and I can go over to my closing. We'll get back to that one just now. As far as the controlling of my schedule is concerned, I need to, under the time knowledge area, I need to see what is my schedule baseline and how are we progressing towards that baseline. Are we ahead of schedule? Are we behind of schedule? What do I need to do about it? And obviously, any changes needs to go through my change control. I also need to control my costs, the same. Are we on budget? Are we over budget, under budget? Will we be able to make it? I also need to control quality. Now, where we asked the question just now, when we were under executing, when we looked at quality assurance, we said, we asked the question, will we be able to deliver according to those quality standards? Under quality control, look at the product and we say, are we actually meeting the quality standards? So, in the majority of the cases, when we're doing quality control, we are busy with either walkthroughs or inspections or testing. looking at our communications, we also need to control our communications. In other words, to see, are we doing what we've promised to do in our communications management plan, and maybe is there a better way of communicating? So process improvement also starts to play a role here. We also need to control risks. We have got our risk management plan, we've come up with responses, we have implemented those response strategies, and they have become part of our scope, our time and our cost, are part of our project management plan. Under monitoring and controlling, we want to make certain that those risk response actions that we've implemented are actually working, that we are managing the threats down, and that we are managing any of the opportunities up. We also need to control our procurement. In other words, make certain that all the parties to this agreement are doing what they're supposed to do. We also need to control our stakeholders to see whether we are managing the stakeholders according to our stakeholder management plan, and also to see if there are better ways of doing it. And all the time when we are executing and monitoring, controlling, we are going to come back to this point under scope where we say, have we done everything? And if so, has everything been accepted? And if the answer is yes, it means that we can now go over to closing out. And first of all, what we'll close out is our procurements. So I need to make certain that all the contracts are finalized. Are there any disputes? Are there any lawsuits or whatever the case outstanding? And we need to resolve them. In real life, you would normally find that in big companies we have got a procurement or legal department, and you can hand it over to them and they will then look after that. And then the very last one that we're going to do is we close our project. Now it says there close project or phase because we have got many ones for phases also, but we've gone through the whole project here, so we are now closing our project. And once we have closed the project, it means that we get final sign-off for the whole project, final reporting and the final sign-off. We have documented any lessons learned, and we are now completely finished with the project. And once that has happened, no project, no more. So we will see the start of our project is when we get our project charter approved under integration, under initiation, and the finalizing of the project is when we close our project or phase. So why do we follow all of this framework? We do that because we want to meet our project's requirements, but we also want to do that while we are supporting the organizational strategy and the objectives of our company. So this is a very quick and a very high level summary of all the 47 processes that we find a lot more information about in our PMBOK guide. That's all for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again in the future. Thank you very much.